Hello, everybody. My name is Philippa Hellawell, and I am the Acting Head of Collections Research at the National Archives. Welcome to the second event in our Methodologies series, Walking Through the Countryside's Forgotten Colonial Histories with historian Corinne Fowler. With the event series Methodologies, we are bringing together researchers, practitioners, and creatives, all who create a new knowledge through research and the interrogation, disruption, and nuance of the archives. Through this programme, we are encouraging you, the audience, to engage with our collection in new and innovative ways, to explore the possibilities for creative collaborations and consider methodologies and practices that reach beyond traditional academic practice and outputs. Before we begin, I have a few points of housekeeping. This session is approximately 1 hour long, finishing at 2 p.m. British Standard Time. This event is being run through Zoom webinar, meaning you can ask questions by submitting them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please submit your questions at any point throughout, and we will come back to them during the Q&A portion of today's event. My colleagues, TNA admin, will be sharing some guidance regarding the Q&A function in the chat. Should you need any technical support during the event, please reach out to us via the chat and they can assist you. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube in due course. We've also enabled live captions. You can access these at the bottom of your screen by clicking Live Transcript, Show Subtitle, or alternatively, you can hide these if you find them distracting by following the same process. And now to introduce our speaker. In her most recent book, Our Island Stories, Country Walks Through Colonial Britain, Corinne Fowler designs and embarks on 10 walks through the British countryside. And she is accompanied by fellow writers, artists, and scholars to reveal its forgotten links to transatlantic slavery and colonialism and their impact on the landscape and rural labourers. Today, Corinne and I will talk about her long-standing interest in the entanglement between rural landscapes and colonialism, walking as a methodology to piece together hidden histories, and the importance of this difficult process of rediscovery to deepen our relationship to the countryside. Corinne Fowler is Professor of Colonialism and Heritage and Museum Studies at the University of Leicester. In 2020, Corinne co-authored an audit of peer-reviewed research about National Trust property's connections to empire, which galvanised the heritage sector to address its colonial stories and became a major media story. The report won the Museums and Heritage Special Recognition Award in 2022 and an Eastern Eye Award in 2023. Before this, Corinne directed Colonial Countryside, National Trust Houses Reinterpreted, which was a child-led history and writing project, resulting in a book of commissioned writing called Colonial Countryside. Corinne's new book, Our Island Stories, Country Walks Through Colonial Britain, was published on the 2nd of May 2024 by Penguin Allen Lane. Corinne is also co-investigator on a Leverhulme research project led by Professor Neil Chakrabarty called the Rural Racism Project. So it's lovely to welcome you here, Corinne. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to start by getting into the essence of this series, Methodologies, and ask you what made you identify walking as a new way, a new methodology to access the history of Britain's colonial past?
Well, I think it's partly a personal passion and enthusiasm of mine. I really love walking, and it stemmed from sort of unpromising beginnings when I was a child and a teenager, with my parents forcing me on Sunday walks, every single walk, regardless, every single week, regardless of the weather, hail, no snacks, no water. Lots of getting lost, but it eventually sort of evolved into this real love of long distance walking. And I suppose inevitably my interest in colonial history came together with my interest in the countryside. And around this time, there were a lot of very important discussions out there which really informed my thinking about the countryside, because there was increasing interest in asking what is the colonial history of the countryside, and what is who belongs or feels they belong or is perceived as belonging to the countryside, and why. How is all of this connected to Englishness and nationalism and so on? And I started thinking about the countryside differently. It began to become unfamiliar to me, even though I thought I knew it so well. And I started thinking about taking walks and seeing the same things in a different way. So it's just a really good method of being grounded in the landscape, so that there are things which you might read about in primary sources or secondary sources, but when you're actually there in that place, you understand certain things that you might not otherwise understand. So, for example, in my banker's walk through Hampshire, which explores the connections between Hampshire and Louisiana, I stood in the middle of this place in this landscape, which had been described as a kind of Arcadia. And I'd always not really understood why this particular banker from the Baring family had chosen this spot. But when I stood there, I could see exactly why he had, and how the money from slavery in Louisiana, those profits had been used to re-landscape that place, and also just the feeling that that place gives of a kind of absent presence, which you're not going to get that from reading something in an archive. You have to stand there and feel it. I also went there with one of my walking companions, Ibrahim Sek, who is a researcher of the history of enslaved people in Louisiana, and he walked around the place and found it extremely spooky, but he also wanted to remember the enslaved as he walked around that place, which includes his ancestors. So there's something about being in that place which puts it all into sort of 3D perspective, and you have that kind of emotionally intelligent understanding of that history, not just something abstract.
Yeah, a kind of immersive history. It's to kind of immerse yourself in the past in a way that's quite difficult when you're placed, in an archive with a document in front of you, and especially the National Archives. We deal with kind of government records, and so it's really difficult, for instance, to get a sense of the voice and the experience of the enslaved. They're people often on the margins of these records, and I think it comes out really strongly from your book. I've got a copy here. It's a wonderful book. It's quite a well-thumbed copy. You can see that I've kind of poured through it. You mentioned about your walking companions, and so just reflecting on that kind of act of immersing yourself in the countryside and helping you to kind of reinterpret it through a different lens. How important were your walking partners in kind of encouraging you and guiding you on that journey? Because again, it's a type of collaborative research as well. Walking, it can be a solo endeavor, but with how you described your experience, it's a very social one as well.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's a big tradition of walking in this country, which is about the lone white man on top of a hill somewhere, and kind of a master of all I survey kind of narrative. And that's been undermined and played about with by writers for some time now. But I think that I really wanted to think about places which were meaningful to the people that I walked with. So I chose 10 people who some of them are friends, some of them are colleagues. I knew all of them. I admire all of their work, and I felt that they were 10 people who I really look up to and whose work has been very significant in their different fields, whether they're writers or artists or even politicians. So I spent some time talking to them, saying, well, which landscape is meaningful to you? Where would you like me to walk? And they would tell me. So I worked with Ingrid Pollard, the Black photographer from who was shortlisted for the Turner Prize, sort of around that time that I walked with her. And she said, I want to go to the lakes because I've been thinking about the lakes and the Black presence in the lakes, and this sort of consistent absence of Black people in postcards or images of the lakes, even though I and my friends and so many people have been either living there or walking there for decades. And you know, where are these postcards? So she always wants to, she took her own postcards, she always wants to slip them into the racks in the shops to just insert that presence there. She never has, but she says she's always tempted. And so people told me what places, what histories and kinds of connections would be meaningful to them. And from there, I started doing the research. And this is the incredible thing about writing this book, that I thought, well, maybe I won't find anything but I found something every single time. It brought out full range of histories. You know, I've got my sugar walk, my cotton walk, my tobacco walk, my banker's walk, my enclosure walk, my opium walk. And it was just a kind of happy accident, but also indicative of how little known some of these stories are to us, and especially to people who live in those places. And it raises a lot of questions about what other histories might we find, because this is, I only did 10 walks. I could have done 50 more.
Yeah, I think what comes out really strongly is just how drenched the English countryside is with its colonial legacy. And it's really interesting that you let your kind of walking companions kind of be the inspiration for those walks. And I think when we think of the countryside, and you communicate this really well in the book, is that we tend to see it as this kind of, idyllic retreat, this kind of, escape from urban centres. And when historically we think about British kind of colonial involvement, we think of port cities, we think Bristol, Liverpool, London, Glasgow, but there's something about the countryside that has historically seemed removed from that. And I suppose your work is kind of bringing that into the conversation, but I think it's fair to say that you've received quite a high degree of resistance for starting this conversation. And I wondered, it'd be good to hear from you about why you think people have found that kind of association between the countryside and colonialism so difficult to accept. But also with that in mind, is there a way that the countryside can help us connect with it a bit more? How can it kind of help us engage with these really difficult, upsetting and troubling histories?
Well, it's a great question. I think, first of all, we sometimes forget that we've sort of absorbed centuries worth of myth making about the countryside, and we have a very emotional connection to it. And that might vary depending on our perceived level of belonging to the countryside, based on the historically inaccurate view that Black people didn't live in the countryside, for example. And I talk about that in the book, and I try to bring that out a lot, as other historians have done very well. But it's this idea that the countryside is at a remove from the world. It's a place of retreat. It's a place where, in pastoral poetry, you've got concepts like the idyll, the Arcadia, the idea of shepherds talking peacefully, or farmers ploughing their fields in a kind of blissful surroundings. And I think that has always been an old idea which has permeated our consciousness. And it means that it's very difficult for us to make the intellectual leap to think about how these places have anything to do whatsoever with the rest of the world, and especially with something like the British Empire and colonial activities of all kinds over 4 centuries. And so I think that it's a sensitive issue, because it really displaces a lot of assumptions about the countryside, which are founded on things which the historical record doesn't really support. The idea that Black people have never lived in the countryside, when they have, going right back, as many people say, to the times of Hadrian's Wall and the soldiers from Africa who were posted on that wall. And I think that's something incredible, that every time I go to these tiny little places, there are these stories of local Black people who, whether they were musicians or artists or brewers or whatever, who have been part of our landscape for all this time, but it's not been very visible to us, that history, until recently. So I think that when it comes to my work, I started off, with the more impactful work I've done with country houses and the National Trust. And I didn't do all this research myself, obviously. The National Trust report was just an audit of all the historical work, the peer-reviewed historical work, which had been published over the last few decades about National Trust houses. But I didn't want to stop at country houses, because that's a history of privileged elite people and propertied families. And I really, really wanted to move further out into countryside and to start asking about agricultural labour, the layout of the land, the history of enclosure. How domestic was that really? The history of villages, hamlets, fields, land ownership. And this is why I kind of moved deeper into the countryside, to give an even more rounded picture of what those connections are. And I hear a lot of people talking about, oh, our countryside is a colonial space, but it's often talked about in very vague terms. And I think that I want to resource that by providing more detail about what the history actually is in different places and how varied that history is too. In terms of helping, sorry, I mean, that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but the other half of your question was really about why the countryside is a useful space for exploring these things. And I think that one of the ways in which I wanted to write about the book was to show that understanding these aspects of our landscape it's not incompatible with the love of that landscape. And that all the people I walked with, although they have personally experienced racism of subtle and less subtle kinds in the countryside, that it's their love of those landscapes and their God-given right to enjoy it and relax in them, have fun in those spaces, but also what those landscapes and histories mean to them. It's kind of soothing, because you're together having these conversations. It's about dialogue. It's about long form conversation, not quick, short interviews. It's about connecting with each other, about connecting with nature, and breaking down some of those misunderstandings in as human way as possible. It's not just a set of facts. It really means something, and it means something different depending on how you are positioned in relation to that history.
And I suppose that kind of the act of walking facilitates those long form conversations, especially with your walking partners. And I think what comes out for things, you're obviously a very talented writer, but the beauty of the landscape, really comes out, this kind of really idyllic kind of rural picture. And I think in a way it's a startling contrast, isn't it, to the horrors of colonialism. And I wondered if, like you said, we could kind of zoom in on some of that detail. I found that the chapter on the enclosure walking incredibly insightful, and there was a connection there between changes in the English landscape and colonial activity in the Caribbean. And so I wondered if you could kind of tell us a bit more about how you went on that process of discovery of connecting enclosure in Norfolk, and that kind of long history of enclosure in Norfolk, and what that meant for rural labourers, but also how that was accelerated by the wealth from the colonies. Like, you had a fantastic example in Earsham Hall.
Yeah, they so I think that, as I said, enclosure is often seen as a very local history type story, and even an English story, but it really isn't. And I think what was fascinating about that, and I mean, obviously this is a series about methodologies, is just putting together historical documents you might not naturally put together. So if you look at the legacies of British slave ownership database, in Norfolk and Suffolk, which was where I walked for this enclosure walk, near the town of Bungay, which is on the border between the two counties. And you look up which local people were receiving slavery wealth, and then who you put that together with enclosure maps. It's absolutely fascinating because you realize that there's a correspondence between when the money was flowing in and how the money was flowing out to be spent on land. So the case of Bungay in Suffolk, Norfolk, Norfolk, is that there's a house called Ersham Hall, which was inherited by William Wyndham Dalling, and his father was the governor of Jamaica, who bought the plantation Donington Castle Estate in Jamaica. And as soon as he got that house, he set about spending that money on expanding his estate. So that did mean stopping up private footpaths. You still have to walk the long way round. This is why grounded research is a really good way. Walking, you see, literally you have to walk the long way round. All the local people couldn't do the shortcuts through the landscape anymore. And he also enclosed, through two different acts of enclosure, the common land, which is where people used to graze their cattle, their sheep. They used to grow things. They sometimes used to live there. And they were collecting stones for their houses, firewood, and gorse for using on forges and stuff like that. For a blacksmith's forge, it burned really, really well. And they suddenly lost that right, and they did protest against it. It was really awful for lots of people. For women, they couldn't ever prove that they owned anything or had a right to live anywhere, so they were out of the picture straight away. But for some men who did have the means, did try to contest this enclosure, these series of enclosures actually, but there were two in particular that William Wyndham Dalling, with his Jamaican wealth, was using. And they didn't win. And a lot of people couldn't afford a lawyer anyway. They had lots of public meetings about it. And they ended up being allocated these kind of poor allotments, which they had to then pay for. So enclosure is a really important phenomenon in Britain because it's really it sort of accelerated the sort of drive of people into wage labour and away from more subsistence or semi-subsistence lifestyles. So there are lots and lots of stories like this, and it's just a question of putting those enclosure maps next to things like the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, or some of the records to do with the East India Company, or any other kind of records which are showing where there were profits from slavery and so on.
And I think what's quite striking, and we've got to be very careful with how we discuss this, I think, is the parallels between colonizing and enclosure. They're not all equivalent processes, but there is that kind of seizure of land, that diminution of rights, these kind of common arguments of, like, the land being empty or underutilized. And yeah, I just wondered that there's more to say about those kind of, because you also kind of had a walk about the one to Tolpuddle about
the labourers walk,
labourers walk, about that kind of connection between British kind of labouring history and broader British colonial history as well, that kind of a similar mentality of elites and their power and how they're kind of subjugating, they're exploiting who they consider their social inferiors.
Oh, definitely. And I think people who were involved in all kind of land struggles in Britain and labour struggles over suppressed wages and just trying to fight for suffrage and all kinds of rights, including the Tolpuddle martyrs, as they're known, who tried to form an agricultural labourers' union and then got sent to the British penal colonies. That there were many parallels drawn between the colonies and what was happening in Britain and these kinds of struggles. And so some of the things that the Tolpuddle martyrs said, well, the most prominent one, and many people like him in the penal colonies who wrote about their experience, said was that the experience of the penal colonies gives a taste of these colonial attitudes and also the way in which unfettered power is made manifest in those spaces, in these colonial spaces, which could be unleashed on Britain. It, like you say, it's important not to make any kind of equivalence between the level of suffering of colonized people, especially enslaved people, who, you know, obviously enslavement happened because there were colonies in order to create the plantations in the first place. It's really important not to conflate the experience of colonized people and especially enslaved people with, you know, oppressed laborers in Britain. But there are parallels, and the key factor for me is that the same figures who were profiting from slavery, from East India Company wealth, whether they were absentee plantation owners or not, that they were the same people who were buying up land, who were major landowners, who held local positions such as being a magistrate or some kind of authority figure, or they'd found that their colonial wealth bought them parliamentary power, that these are the same figures, and that it kind of worked both ways.
Yeah, and even kind of, you know, people of the church, like in the Norfolk Walk, the Enclosure Walk, you know, the rectors who had a share in plantations in Jamaica, also enclosed lands which, you know, laborers could have used for free, but then they were taxed to use. And you do see that link between colonial authority and colonial activity and authority in England in action. And I think what's striking is just how slavery in Jamaica, you know, many thousand miles away, is physically changing the English landscape with the money that is being poured in through these wealthy families. And I remember reading the striking statistic from your book that between 1750 and 1820, 21% of England was enclosed by parliamentary decree. That's an extraordinary proportion of the land.
It's like a mass privatization of the land. I mean, I suppose land ownership in Britain is one of the biggest legacies of colonial wealth in Britain that we don't really talk about or recognize as being a major thing. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate because it's different in different regions, but it's definitely a major legacy of colonial wealth.
And this kind of process of enclosure just coincides with colonial expansion. You see these you know, territorial changes both in England and in the British Empire. I could talk to you forever about the different walks that you've done, but I also, while we've got you here, I want to talk to you about another book that you've also had published this year. You've been a very busy woman, which is the Colonial Countryside book. So I wondered if you could just give a brief introduction to this project, because this is the work that you've been doing with the National Trust, and because this series is on methodologies, you know, this is all about creative responses to historical subject matter. So it'd be really useful to kind of hear from you, you know, the origins of this project and why you thought it was important to commission work in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I used to be a school teacher, so I was very keen to work with children. So I established the Colonial Countryside project with Heritage Lottery money and Arts Council money. And I worked with 100 school children across the UK. And we basically chose 10 National Trust houses in close partnership with the National Trust, obviously. And we had a team of historians guiding the sort of academic side of things. And we commissioned 10 writers to respond to the history which the historians were drawing attention to. And the children also produced writing as a result of that. And the photographer on the project was Ingrid Pollard, who I ended up walking with on my opium walk through the Lake District. So I think that this project sort of went on over a number of years, and it ended quite recently, I suppose. It ended in about 2022, and then we've only just brought the book of commissioned writing out. So that book, Colonial Countryside, has photographs by Ingrid Pollard of the children that we were collaborating with. It's also got the 10 short stories and some poetry cycles about 10 National Trust houses. And each piece of creative writing is accompanied by an short historical commentary, just talking about what the foundation, the history is behind the stories or the commissioned writing. So, I mean, this book I had wanted to do for years, and it really means a lot to me. It was a long time coming, partly delayed by COVID and printers closing down, stuff like that. But I'm just really happy that it's out now, because that project was such a heartfelt, emotional, meaningful project. And it was really the kind of engine that drove eventually the National Trust report to be written and published. So it's a very important project in terms of also the way we work with children, because the children, I think people often patronize children even when they don't mean to. And I'm very interested in the intellectual and emotional life of children and the insights, wisdom, and creativity that they have. And so I'm really keen never to look down on them, but to say, what do these spaces mean to you? And how would you like to engage with them? And they came up with some nice short personal essays on various objects that we'd talked about, the history behind them. They made some Twitter videos, they wrote poetry, but they also asked some very important questions, not just of us, but of the National Trust houses, and about objects that should or shouldn't be displayed in this way or that way. And they always asked very unusual questions. But I think the important thing about the commissioned writing is, again, this is not just a series of blank facts. This is a meaningful history which has its legacies today, and the human dimensions of it need to be embraced and understood and respected. So that's what that writing is about, to really not just bring the history alive, but to imagine what it was like for those people who were caught up in the center of those stories, and to get just beyond polemic. We didn't want any polemic. We just want a loving active imagination to think about those people who were colonized or enslaved, or who were black servants in some of these places, for example.
And children that, I agree, they ask the plainest questions, but they're some of the most fundamental ones that kind of escape you, because there's living decades, you develop your own assumptions, ideologies, preferences.
Yeah, we all get a bit conventional, and our thinking gets a bit restricted. We end up on the same tracks all the time. It's great working with children.
Well, yeah, no, I think we can think about, working with children as research methodology in a way, like
yeah,
how
definitely.
We challenge our own assumptions. I think they say that, if you're presenting your PhD research, it's good to kind of explain it to children and get them to ask you questions, because they can ask you the most basic things that you've overlooked, but also kind of speaking, like you said, to, especially in the context of histories of colonialism and enslavement, like I feel children are very in tune to the human element of history,
Mm.
and therefore do actually approach things with a quite mature sense of care and virtue. And it's really interesting to hear about your background teaching in schools. And there were some great stories in this book, and one of them was about a formerly enslaved person called Diego in Panama, and the connections with Buckland Abbey, which was the residence of Francis Drake. And
Yeah.
you know, as you know, it's so difficult to kind of construct histories of, you know, enslaved people, or even kind of, you know, Black people in history who have their agency or power taken away from them. And so I wondered, you know, how can kind of creative responses, creative writing fill that gap and help us kind of flesh out our understanding of the past, which, you know, records such as those that we have at TNA, kind of bureaucratic records, don't give that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a great tradition yourselves in the National Archives of looking at some of the colonial records, haven't you? And turning them into fantastic radio plays. So I love that. I think with the example of Diego, the story behind that was that, as you say, Francis Drake lived in Buckland Abbey, and he had this encounter, which is explored in the story, which we know quite a lot about from the historical record through the work of Miranda Kaufman, the Black Tudors. She was our lead historian on the Colonial Countryside Project. So he had this encounter with Diego, who was formerly enslaved by the Spanish, but he had made this bid for freedom, and that's when he encountered the English, and he kind of went over to them, and he became a circumnavigator, very, very valuable to Francis Drake. And Francis Drake brought him back to Plymouth on a number of occasions, and they had many voyages in each other's company. And Miranda Kaufman has found really quite extensive records about this. But what I love about the story in that we commissioned is it really starts from this moment of encounter between Diego and Francis Drake, and who initially shot at him, or were it was a very threatening encounter. But through it just he becomes he's portrayed as such an imaginative, creative, powerful character. It's a beautiful story. It's one of my favorites, and it doesn't ever sanitize that history either, or gloss over any of the difficult bits. But it's just that Diego becomes the center of that story, not Francis Drake. So this is why it's a great way of working. I don't know if I've answered your question,
Yeah, no,
actually.
absolutely. And it's a wonderful short story as well. Like you say, it centers Diego. And what I found really moving were the kind of allusions to being on a ship. Obviously, he's known for kind of circumnavigating, you know, being on the water with Drake, but just things like how it was novelty for him to walk above the hold of the ship unbound, which is such a kind of drawing back, you know, his experience of as a child being brought from the west coast of Africa, you know, to South America, these allusions to slavery in the Middle Passage. And yeah, it is a powerful way of centering those, and kind of goes back to when we talked about methodologies of that kind of critical fabulation that Saidiya Hartman talks about how based on the historical record, we can create kind of plausible, creative narratives, which can help us understand the experience of those people who are not centered in the records themselves. And as an editor of these stories and creative responses, you know, what did you take from this in terms of the working relationship between creatives and historians? Because as you say, following, I'm interested in the origins of that chuckle, but you know, how they work together. Is it a model that we can kind of take forward, or are the lessons learned from this about how to kind of improve that collaboration?
It's definitely a good model, because as long as the historians don't insist on dictating what happens in the imagination of the writers, it works brilliantly, and it did work brilliantly in all cases, because the historians were serving the writers. So as long as the writers were kind of at the center of this process. So they, as the creators, were saying, well, I want to do this with the story. Is that historically likely? Or which archive should I go into? Where can I find the richest documents to really help me imagine this scenario? And the historians would then assist them and say, you need to go to this archive, you need to go to this document, and how about this? And they'd give them reading material, which would help them to do that. But it's also true that one of the writers, Peter Carlew, he had written about Speke Hall. This is another one of I love all of the stories that were produced, but I really love this one too, because I sort of feel closest to it in a way, because I've followed. He's one of my fellow walkers in my other book, and I followed his writing for years, and all the different sort of twists and turns he's taken, productive twists and turns. And he really he stuck really closely to the historical record, and then he went off on a kind of, it's not a flight of fancy, because it's some really unpleasant history that he explored, but he definitely deviated from what he knew was there. But then it turned out, after he'd written his story, that we found some more documents, and it was incredibly close to what had actually happened. Wow. So the reason for his kind of uncanny accuracy, you can find all kinds of non-logical or non-logical explanations, but it was also because he knew the kind of thing that used to happen in Jamaica and in during that period, and so it was just an incredibly powerful guess.
And it's also quite nice, because it kind of decenters academia and historians, doesn't it, and gives a voice to the kind of narrative surrounding that, and people who might have kind of ancestral connection to those histories, and so
exactly.
Powerful.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm going to move on to the Q&A now, because we've got quite a few questions coming in. A brilliant question here. I don't know who's actually posted this question, but beyond talking about how colonial histories have impacted the countryside and the people who use it for recreation, are there any practical steps we can take to decolonize rural Britain?
It's a really good question. I mean, on the Rural Racism Project, we're having 100 conversations with people about this topic, the topic of rural racism and what people have experienced in the countryside. And one of the themes that comes out surprisingly prominently is how much of an inspiration colonial history has been for people to start newly exploring the countryside, or even living in it, and saying, well, hang on, there is not a separate rural history that's got nothing to do with other continents. It's all integrated in some way, and let's go and explore. And it's actually driven people to explore the countryside more. In terms of decolonizing it, well, I think the first thing that needs to be done is to understand what the colonial history is. You can't. One of the frustrations I have at the moment is there's a lot of vagueness in conversations about, decolonizing the countryside. Vagueness in the sense that it's absolutely accurate to say that the history has a colonial, the countryside has a colonial history, and therefore it needs to be addressed. But I think we can't address it unless we know what it is in any detail. And so each local area has a very unique history, which has different implications for addressing it. So you can have what I found is that there are one useful way forward is to actually show the connections between British rural history and colonial history. So, for example, as I did in my labourers' walk, and to show some of the anti-colonial alliances that were going on across continents as well, as people like Priya Gopal have done in her book. Another one is to understand the history of extraction. So, for example, copper. And another one is to sort of think about the history of production, such as wool, and the connection. I've got a wool walk showing the connection between wool production and slavery, and the primary market for some of the wool that was produced, woolen cloth that was produced in northern Wales. And there's the history of trade. So there are tobacco stories, opium stories, and so on, and the history of finance, hence my banker's walk. So I think it's just exploring more together what the local rural histories are, and then thinking about what that implies about how we then move forward.
No, that's a really helpful response, and I think looking at some of these questions, a lot of them are about kind of practical ways forward, and I think that's something that maybe speaks to you as well, because I think these are not just kind of creative academic exercises for you. This is about creating kind of tangible change and changes in people's mindset, and also kind of institutional changes as well. Lucy in the Q&A has just said your work is built upon collaboration, and I wonder whether you might be able to talk a little bit about how to build productive strategic collaborations. So here she's particularly thinking about collaborations with or within institutions where equity and decolonization are often given lip service but not necessarily resourced.
Yeah, 100%.
To kind of carry that out. So what is your perspective on this about building those productive strategic collaborations?
It's so tricky to manage. There are large heritage organizations and museums as well, which I won't necessarily name, but partners come out feeling terrible afterwards. They find that they've not been well treated at all, and those organisations are often completely unaware about why they've treated people insensitively or always made them feel like the junior partner because they're smaller, and these organisations are very big. So I think that obviously you don't want that, and I think that when an organisation wants to get money, and they must get it resourced properly, they must apply for funding or work with someone to get funding so that something's properly resourced, not done on a shoestring, not done as an afterthought. That once that's that process begins, that the partner must be there right from the beginning. You can't create a project and then invite people in to do it afterwards. You have to do it through dialogue. But I think you have to have agreements that, in my opinion, the people in the organisation should really be serving the partner. I actually think the partner should be in charge. And there have to be agreements to do it. Likewise, with collaborations with academics, academics should be servants of the people they're working with, not the other way around. They should, use their skill and networks to get money or to create space to make things happen. And then there's always the question of, are those organisations representative of the population at large, the demographic at large, or in that area? Are the people sitting in the room, do they look anything like the people who, if you got a random sample of people from the local area, do they look anything like that? If they don't, it's a problem. So I think it is a fraught situation, and I think sometimes it's easier to work independently from some of these organisations because those organisations are just not ready they're not equipped or willing to make the shift in their minds and practice that's required. But where they are, it can be really productive. But I think you need to make sure people have enough time to do things properly, that there's enough senior buy-in from the organisation, and that it's central to the policy of that organisation, and that policy is flexes and changes as a result of the encounter with partners.
Mm-hmm. And that these things need to be established at the start as well as a kind
Exactly,
of
yeah. From the
agreement.
beginning, you don't want to. People tell me all the time, "Oh, I got invited onto something," and they said, "Is it all right? We've put your name on this bid. Is that all right?" Yeah, and they think someone will be happy just because they're getting the money. It's just not okay to do that. It never was, and it's never will be.
Thank you. I'm gonna finish with two questions which kind of take us back to the countryside. So one is from John, and he wants to ask, if you had to pick one or two things, what do you think are the main reasons why the romanticized fantasy of the rural idyll has been so strongly enshrined in British or English views of the countryside in the past?
Yeah.
So that's the first one. And the second one is asking about, would you say that your book takes on an environmental history approach because of the links between slavery in Jamaica, for instance, in that particular chapter, and how it affected the landscape? So first of all, about the origins, or the why we hold the countryside in such high esteem, and secondly, methodologically speaking, is this a form of kind of immersive environmental history, or would you say that this is something a little bit different?
Okay, so I was asked for two things. Well, the first thing is that the history of the Black presence in the countryside is not widely known, and that really distorts people's view of our rural past. Those ordinary everyday presences especially in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, they're just missing from what we learn about the countryside in school or anywhere else. The second major factor is the pastoral literary tradition of poetry, especially, but pastoral writing more generally. It has its origins in ancient Greek and sort of Latin verse, and it's an imported idea which has just taken root and become part of our consciousness, and has left us with these ideas of idyll, Arcadia, and so on. It has many internal ironies, that situation, because even the work called Arcadia was written on an estate which was landscaped by evicting the villagers from their houses so that a view could be formed through this re-landscaping. So, there's it's always been a facade, obviously, and but it's very formative of our ideas, and at the same time, I think we have a vague sense of rural poverty, and now as well as then, but it seems to exist in some kind of imaginative pocket, in a separate pocket in our minds from this kind of pastoral tradition, although that's also got an anti-pastoral tradition built into it, which is protesting that sanitized depiction of the countryside and rural history. So, I mean, there's those two things. The second half of the question,
Environmental history.
I would say I do it superficially. I'm really interested in the environment and things like rewilding, and also I don't own a car and I use trains, and but I all of that kind of stuff. I think there's some interesting work emerging from someone sent me an advance copy of a book which I can't remember the name of, which is all about the colonialism and the damaging of the environment, the origins of this during the colonial period. And I mention it in my chapter on Barbados, which is the labourers' walk. I explain how the land was depleted through the creation of sugar plantations and what the environmental legacy of that is. But I think there's a lot more needs to be done on that.
Yeah, because I think one of the questions was also asking about similar approaches that have been taken. Is there any kind of books or projects that you'd recommend to people who are also kind of looking at these links between kind of countryside and colonialism?
I'll tell you what, that when you're kind of saying goodbye to everyone, I'll run into the next room and I'll find that book and hold it up, which has just been sent to me, which looks, I haven't read it yet, but I've seen the summary of it, and I think that person seems to be doing exactly what the questioner is asking. So I'm really keen to read that book as well. It's not out yet, but
brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Corinne, for being such a generous guest and answering all these questions kind of fully and openly. And, you know, it's a great pleasure for us to host you, to learn more about your work. And, you know, we just, you know, hope you kind of continue with the same kind of energy and spirit that you have with your projects over the last few years, because it's such important work, and to kind of, it really goes towards that kind of, you know, public understanding of empire and how it's not a question of something that happened across the globe, but something that actually had implications at home as well. So thank you very much. Thank you for joining us and for providing us insight also into methodologies as well, which is the core focus of this series. And thank you to the audience as well for joining us today. There were great conversations and a really active chat as well. If you are interested in exploring the topic further and knowing more about collections related to colonial history, on labour movements and land ownership, and the records that we have related to that at the National Archives, we have put together a resource which can be emailed to you following the event. If you did enjoy today's methodology session, we do have a few more events as part of the series over the coming weeks that may be of interest. So this is the book that, can you just go back a little bit? The Burning of the Earth. Yeah, that was right.
The Burning Earth, An Environmental History of the Last 500 Years by Sunil Amrith.
Okay, so that's to one to put on your Christmas wish list. Thank you, Corinne. So in the spirit of the series, we've got an event coming up on the 1st of October, where we'll be hearing from Sarah Ellis, who is Director of Digital Development at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and she will be sharing with us ways in which digital research can inform creativity, and how the Royal Shakespeare Company, which is the first performing arts organisation to be granted independent research organisation status, they are continuing to navigate the intersections of performance and emerging technologies to engage enhancement with Shakespeare. We're also excited to announce an additional session in the series titled Following the Thread, Creative Responses to the Archive with Michelle Rodriguez. And that is on Tuesday, the 15th of October, where you can join Michelle and TNA colleagues in conversation to explore how Michelle's practice as an artist and an arts counsellor has drawn her to the archive, and the absences and gaps and traces of trauma within it. And this panel will reflect on their experiences running the innovative and engaging Golden Thread weekend at the National Archives earlier this year. So a lot of the kind of same themes that Corinne and I spoke about, and you can find out more and register to attend via our website, and the link should be posted in the chat shortly. We'd also really appreciate if you could take 5 to 10 minutes to complete our post-event survey, which will be emailed to you soon. But that is it for me. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks for all your questions. But most of all, thanks to Corinne for sharing with us today. Goodbye.